The telegram trembled in Josephine Vaughn's hands as she stood on the dusty platform of Deer Lodge, Montana territory, realizing that the man who'd sent for her had died 3 weeks before she arrived, leaving her stranded 1,500 miles from the Philadelphia boarding house she'd called home. The station master, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained whiskers, had delivered the news with all the sensitivity of someone announcing the weather. "Yep, old Chester took a fall from his horse. Broke his neck clean through. Real shame that. You're the mail-order bride, I suppose." He'd scratched his considerable belly and wandered back inside before she could form a coherent response, leaving her alone with 2 carpetbags, $17 to her name, and absolutely nowhere to go. The September afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Josephine surveyed the town that was supposed to have been her salvation. Deer Lodge stretched before her in a ramshackle collection of wooden buildings and false fronts, all coated in the same reddish dust that seemed to permeate everything. The Rocky Mountains loomed in the distance, beautiful and indifferent to her predicament. She'd traded one form of desperation for another, it seemed. At 22 years old, she'd exhausted her welcome at the boarding house, her meager savings as a seamstress barely covering her keep. Chester Hendrick's advertisement had seemed like divine intervention, a widower rancher seeking a wife for companionship and help with his property. She hadn't expected love, just security and purpose. Now she had neither. Josephine picked up her bags, her back already aching from the endless train journey, and started walking down the main street. She needed to find somewhere to stay while she figured out what to do next. Perhaps there was seamstress work here, though the town looked small enough that such luxuries might already be spoken for. The boardwalk creaked under her feet as she passed a general store, a saloon with swinging doors, and what appeared to be a marshal's office. "You lost, miss." A woman's voice called out from the doorway of a modest building with a sign reading Thompson's Boarding House. She was perhaps 40, with kind eyes and flour dusting her apron. "I'm looking for lodging," Josephine said, trying to keep the desperation from her voice. "Just for a night or two while I sort out my circumstances." The woman's expression shifted to something resembling pity. "You're Chester Hendrick's bride, aren't you? Word travels fast in a small town. Come on in, dear. I'm Martha Thompson. First night's on the house, and we'll figure out the rest from there." Josephine wanted to protest the charity, but exhaustion and relief won out. She followed Martha inside to a clean, simple room with a narrow bed and a washstand. After Martha left, promising supper at 6, Josephine finally allowed herself to cry, pressing her face into the pillow to muffle the sound. She'd been so careful, so practical about this entire arrangement, and still fate had found a way to pull the rug from under her feet. The next morning, Josephine woke with renewed determination. Feeling sorry for herself wouldn't change anything. She dressed in her most practical calico dress, pinned her dark blonde hair into a neat bun, and went downstairs to inquire about work opportunities in town. Martha was in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with practiced efficiency. "There's a ranch about 5 miles out," Martha said thoughtfully when Josephine explained her situation. "The Xerxes place. Yates Xerxes runs it with just a couple of hands. His mother passed last winter, and from what I hear, the place has gone to chaos. No woman's touch, you understand. He might could use a housekeeper, though I'll warn you he's not much for conversation. Keeps to himself mostly. I can cook, clean, mend, and I'm not afraid of hard work," Josephine said firmly. "How do I get there?" "You can't walk it, not in this heat and with your city shoes," Martha said, eyeing Josephine's worn leather boots. "Tell you what, my husband drives the supply wagon out that way this afternoon. He can take you, and if it doesn't work out, he'll bring you back. But Josephine, you should know that Yates has a reputation for being difficult. Not mean, mind you, just solitary. Some folks think he's been alone too long. Josephine squared her shoulders. I've dealt with difficult before. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I'll repay your kindness someday. The wagon ride that afternoon gave Josephine her first real view of Montana territory. The landscape was vast and unforgiving, golden grasslands stretching toward mountains that seemed both close and impossibly far away. Mr. Thompson, a taciturn man who apparently saved all his words for his wife, pointed out landmarks with economical gestures. When they finally turned down a dirt road marked by a weathered wooden arch, Josephine's stomach clenched with nervousness. The Xerxes ranch was larger than she'd expected, with a substantial two-story house that had clearly seen better days, a huge barn, several outbuildings and corrals holding horses. Everything had a neglected air, from the peeling paint to the weeds growing unchecked around the porch. A few chickens scratched in the yard and somewhere a dog barked. "Wait here," Mr. Thompson said, the most words he'd spoken all journey. He climbed down and walked toward the barn, calling out for Yates Xerxes. Josephine watched as a man emerged from the barn's shadows, and her breath caught slightly. Even from a distance, Yates Xerxes was imposing. He stood well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of someone who worked hard every day. As he came closer, she could make out more details. He was perhaps 28 or 30, with dark hair that needed cutting, a strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of beard, and eyes that were startlingly blue even in the afternoon light. He wore dusty work clothes and moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. Those blue eyes flicked to her briefly before returning to Mr. Thompson, and Josephine felt assessed and dismissed in that single glance. The two men spoke for several minutes, too quietly for her to hear. She saw Mr. Thompson gesture in her direction, saw Yates shake his head firmly, saw Mr. Thompson persist. Finally, Yates looked directly at her again, and this time the look lasted longer. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze steadily. She might be desperate, but she wasn't defeated. Yates said something else to Mr. Thompson, then walked toward the wagon. Up close, he was even more striking, though there was a hardness to him, a wall that seemed to keep the world at bay. His eyes, which should have been warm given their color, were guarded and cool. "Mr. Thompson says you need work," he said without preamble. His voice was deep, roughened by years of shouting orders across open range. "Says you were supposed to marry Chester Hendricks." "That's correct," Josephine said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm a hard worker, Mr. Xerxes. I can keep house, cook, clean, mend clothing, tend a garden, and I learn quickly. Don't need a housekeeper." The blunt rejection stung, but Josephine pressed on. "With respect, sir, your house suggests otherwise. I'm not asking for charity. I'll work for room and board until I can afford train fare back east. 1 month, perhaps 2. Something flickered in those blue eyes, though she couldn't read what. "Got no room for a woman here. It wouldn't be proper, just me and 2 ranch hands." "I noticed a small cabin near the barn," Josephine said, refusing to give up. "If it's habitable, I could stay there. You'd have a clean house and proper meals, and I'd have a roof over my head while I earn my way. Everyone benefits." Yates stared at her for a long moment, and she had the distinct impression he was trying to figure out what to make of her. Finally, he looked at Mr. Thompson. "That cabin hasn't been used in years. No telling what state it's in." "I'm not afraid of dirt," Josephine said firmly. Another long silence. Then, surprisingly, the corner of Yates' mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it softened his harsh features fractionally. "Stubborn, aren't you? Determined," she corrected. This time he did smile, just barely. 1 month. Room and board, and I'll pay you $10 besides. But I keep irregular hours and I expect meals when I need them, not on some fixed schedule. Can you manage that? Yes, sir. Don't call me sir, makes me feel old. Yates is fine. He turned to Mr. Thompson. I'll see she gets back to town if it doesn't work out. Thanks for the trouble. After Mr. Thompson left, Yates picked up Josephine's carpetbags without asking and started walking toward the small cabin. She hurried to follow him across the dusty yard. The cabin was indeed small, perhaps 12 feet square, with a single window and a door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Inside, it was thick with dust and cobwebs, containing only a narrow bed frame without a mattress, a rickety table, and a chair. I'll bring you a mattress from the house, Yates said, setting her bags down, and blankets. There's a pump outside you can use for washing, privies behind the barn, meals you'll cook in the main house kitchen. He paused, then added awkwardly, It's not much. It'll do fine once I clean it up, Josephine said, though privately she was calculating how much work the cabin would need. Thank you for taking a chance on me, Mr. Xerxes. Yates, he reminded her, and don't thank me yet. You haven't seen the state of the main house. He left, returning shortly with a mattress that he wrestled onto the bed frame, along with blankets, sheets, and a pillow that smelled of lavender, probably his late mother's. I'll leave you to settle in. Come up to the house when you're ready and I'll show you around. After he left, Josephine stood in the middle of the dusty cabin and took a deep breath. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She found a broom in one of the outbuildings and swept out months, perhaps years, of accumulated dirt and debris. She scrubbed the floor, the walls, the single window until her hands were raw. She made up the bed with the clean linens and unpacked her few belongings. By the time she finished, the sun was lowering in the sky, and the cabin, while still humble, was clean and livable. The main house was indeed in need of a woman's touch, as Martha had diplomatically put it. Josephine found Yates in the kitchen, attempting to cook something that involved beans and salt pork and wasn't going well. He looked up when she entered, something sheepish crossing his face. Not much of a cook, he admitted. So I see. May I? She gestured to the stove. He stepped aside willingly, and Josephine assessed what supplies were available. The larder was better stocked than she'd expected, with flour, sugar, salt, coffee, dried beans, salt pork, and some potatoes that were starting to sprout. Not much, but she could work with it. While Yates watched from the doorway, she salvaged his beans, fried up the salt pork properly, and made a quick pan of cornbread. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and edible. 2 ranch hands came in as she was setting the table. They introduced themselves as Pete and Cisco, both weathered men in their 40s who looked at her with undisguised curiosity, but were polite enough. The 4 of them ate in relative silence, though Josephine noticed both ranch hands cleaned their plates enthusiastically. That was real good, miss, Pete said when he finished. Best meal we've had in months. It was just beans and cornbread, Josephine said, but she was pleased nonetheless. Better than Yates' cooking, Cisco said with a grin. No offense, boss. None taken, Yates said dryly. You're not wrong. After the men left, Josephine began clearing the table, but Yates stopped her. You've done enough for today. Settling in and cleaning that cabin plus cooking dinner. Get some rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to start properly. I don't mind, she began, but he shook his head. I mean it. Go on now. Josephine wanted to protest that she'd had far longer days in Philadelphia, but something in his tone told her he wouldn't budge. She nodded and headed back to her cabin, where exhaustion finally caught up with her. She changed into her nightgown, said her prayers, and climbed into bed. Despite everything, despite the uncertainty of her situation, she fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, she woke before dawn to the sound of roosters crowing. She dressed quickly and made her way to the main house, determined to prove her worth. The kitchen was empty, but she heard sounds from the barn. She got a fire going in the stove and assessed what she could make for breakfast. Eggs from the chickens, more salt pork, coffee. She found some sourdough starter that was still alive, though barely, and began planning proper bread for later. Yates came in as she was setting breakfast on the table, surprise crossing his face. "Didn't expect you up this early." "Ranch work starts early, doesn't it?" she said simply. "Coffee's ready." He poured himself a cup, and she noticed how his shoulders relaxed slightly at the first sip. Pete and Cisco joined them shortly, and breakfast was consumed with the same efficient silence as dinner had been. Josephine ate quickly and began cleaning up, then started on the kitchen itself, which needed a thorough scrubbing. "What do you need from town?" Yates asked, startling her. She'd thought he'd left with the other men. "Supplies. I can make a list if you're going." "Make your list. I'll see what I can do." She quickly wrote down things that would make cooking easier and more varied, trying to be conservative with her requests, but Yates glanced at it and nodded. "Reasonable. I'll be back this afternoon." After he left, Josephine threw herself into cleaning the house. It was clear that Yates' mother had kept a tidy home, but months of neglect had taken their toll. Josephine washed windows, scrubbed floors, beat rugs, dusted every surface. She found evidence of Mrs. Xerxes everywhere. Embroidered pillows, carefully tended plants that had died from neglect, photographs on the mantel showing a stern-looking woman with kind eyes and the same dark hair as her son. There was a photograph of a man who must have been Yates' father, and one of a much younger Yates with both parents, before hard living had carved lines into his face. When Yates returned that afternoon with supplies, the house was transformed. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, taking in the gleaming surfaces, the swept floors, the general air of order, and something unreadable crossed his face. "You didn't have to do all this in one day," he said quietly. "I wanted to earn my keep," Josephine replied, putting away the supplies he'd brought. He'd purchased everything on her list and more, including fresh vegetables and a chicken that was already butchered. "You've earned it," he said, still in that quiet tone. Then he turned and left before she could respond. Over the following days, a routine established itself. Josephine woke early, cooked breakfast, spent her days cooking, cleaning, mending the men's work clothes, and tending the sad remains of what had once been a kitchen garden. She cooked dinner, cleaned up, and retreated to her cabin. The work was hard but satisfying. The house slowly came back to life under her care. Yates remained distant but not unkind. He spoke little, and when he did, it was usually to ask about supplies or make a practical observation. He worked from dawn until well after dusk, pushing himself with a relentlessness that Josephine found concerning. Sometimes she'd see him standing alone, looking out at the mountains, and the loneliness radiating from him was almost palpable. A week into her stay, she noticed he'd skipped breakfast and hadn't come in for lunch either. She made sandwiches and coffee, and brought them out to the barn where he was mending fence posts that he'd apparently decided to fix immediately rather than wait. "You need to eat," she said, setting the basket down. "I'll eat when I'm done." "You'll be more efficient if you eat now," she countered. "Even horses need to be fed regularly." He looked up at that, and she thought she saw the ghost of a smile. "Comparing me to a horse, if the horseshoe fits." The words came out before she could stop them, and she immediately regretted her impertinence. But Yates surprised her by actually laughing, a rusty sound as if he was out of practice. Fair enough. He set down his tools and joined her in the shade, accepting the sandwich and coffee. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before he spoke again. "You're a good cook, better than my mother was, though don't tell her ghost I said so. Your secret's safe with me." Josephine hesitated, then added, "She kept a beautiful home. You can tell she cared a great deal." Yates' expression shuddered. "She did. House hasn't been the same since she passed. Nothing has." He stood abruptly. "Thanks for the food." That night, Josephine made pot roast with the vegetables Yates had bought, along with fresh bread from the sourdough she'd nursed back to health. When she served it, Pete actually looked close to tears. "My mother used to make pot roast," he said. "Haven't had it in 20 years. "It's just pot roast," Josephine said, embarrassed by the attention. "It's a good meal shared with others," Cisco corrected. "That's worth something." Yates said nothing, but he had a second helping, which Josephine took as a compliment. The days turned into 2 weeks, then 3. Josephine found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life. She learned when the men needed hearty breakfasts before long days and when lighter fare would do. She memorized how Yates took his coffee, black with 1 sugar, and how he'd sometimes stand on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset with an expression of such profound loneliness that it made her chest ache. She told herself she was simply being observant, learning the household's needs. She didn't let herself examine too closely why she looked forward to the rare moments when Yates would linger after a meal, or why her heart beat faster when he smiled, which he was doing marginally more often. One evening, nearly a month into her stay, a storm rolled in from the mountains. Josephine was in the main house finishing up dinner dishes when the rain started, first in scattered drops, then in sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, and she thought of her little cabin with its thin walls. "You should stay in the house tonight," Yates said from the doorway, making her jump. "Storm's going to be bad. There's a spare room upstairs. Used to be mine before I moved into my father's room." "I'll be fine in the cabin," Josephine said automatically. "Roof on that cabin's not been maintained. Likely to leak. Maybe worse." He spoke matter-of-factly, but there was concern underneath. "Not asking you to do anything improper. Pete and Cisco are in the bunkhouse. You'll have the upstairs to yourself, but I'd rest easier knowing you're not in that cabin if the storm gets worse." Josephine wanted to argue to maintain her independence, but a particularly loud crack of thunder decided for her. "All right. Thank you." The spare room was simple but clean, with a larger bed than her cabin's and a wardrobe that still held some of Mrs. Xerxes' things. Josephine changed into her nightgown and climbed into bed, listening to the storm rage outside. She was just drifting off when she heard it, a sound so raw and broken it made her sit up immediately. Someone was crying. She found Yates in what must have been his mother's room, sitting on the floor beside the bed, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking. The storm had masked the sound, but now that she was closer, she could hear the ragged breaths, the suppressed sobs of someone who'd held grief inside for too long. "Yates," she said softly. He looked up, and in the lamplight his face was ravaged. "Sorry, I thought I was quieter." Josephine didn't think. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the floor, propriety forgotten. "How long since you've let yourself grieve? Since she died?" 8 months. He wiped at his face roughly. "I had to be strong, had to keep the ranch running, had to make sure everything was handled. Didn't have time to fall apart." "So you're falling apart now, seems like it," he laughed bitterly. "Some tough cowboy I am. Grief doesn't make you weak," Josephine said gently. "It makes you human, and storms have a way of bringing out what we've buried." They sat in silence for a moment, the storm raging outside, before Yates spoke again. "She was sick for 2 years. Cancer, the doctor said. Toward the end, I had to do everything for her. Feed her, help her dress, everything. And I didn't mind. She was my mother. But after she died, I couldn't stand being in this house. Everything reminded me of her. So I let it go to hell, and I worked myself into exhaustion every day so I wouldn't have to think about it." Until I showed up and cleaned everything, Josephine said, understanding dawning. Yeah. And at first I was angry about it, which makes no sense. But seeing the house like it was when she was alive, it made it real again, made me realize she's really gone. His voice broke on the last word. Josephine did something bold then. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. She's gone, but the love you had for her isn't. That stays. And I think she'd want you to live, truly live, not just work yourself into the ground. Yates looked at their joined hands, then at her face. Why are you being so kind to me? I've barely spoken to you. I've kept you at a distance. Because everyone deserves kindness, especially when they are hurting. She paused, then added more quietly, and because I know what it's like to feel unwanted, to feel like you're just taking up space in the world. Who made you feel that way? The question was so fierce, so protective, that Josephine felt tears prick her eyes. Life, I suppose. I was orphaned at 15, sent to a boarding house where I was more obligation than guest. I worked as a seamstress, barely making enough to cover my keep. When I saw Chester Hendrick's advertisement, I thought maybe someone finally wanted me, even if it was just for practical purposes. Then I got here and found out he was dead, and it felt like the universe confirming what I'd always suspected. That I'm someone people don't keep. That's not true, Yates said vehemently. You're hardworking, kind, talented. Anyone would be lucky to have you. Then why have you kept me at arm's length? The question slipped out before she could stop it, more vulnerable than she'd intended. Yates was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. Because you're temporary. You said 1 month, maybe 2, until you had trained fair back east. And I knew if I let myself get used to having you here, if I let myself care, it would hurt when you left. I've had enough of losing people I care about. Josephine's heart was pounding. What if I didn't want to leave? He looked at her sharply. What? What if I wanted to stay, not as a housekeeper, but as something more permanent? The words tumbled out in a rush. I know it's bold of me to say, and I know you don't know me that well, but I'm happy here. Happier than I've been in years. I like cooking for you and Pete and Cisco. I like bringing the house back to life. I like seeing the mountains every morning. And I like you, Yates Xerxes, even though you're stubborn and work too hard and barely talk. Josephine, he said her name like a prayer. You don't know what you're saying. You're just feeling sorry for me because you found me crying. I'm not, she insisted. I've been feeling this way for weeks. I just didn't know how to say it. And yes, maybe finding you like this pushed me to be honest, but that doesn't make it less true. Yates was staring at her like he couldn't quite believe she was real. Slowly, carefully, he reached up and cupped her face with his free hand, his palm rough and warm against her cheek. If you stay, if we do this, I need you to understand something. I'm not good at talking about my feelings. I'm going to mess up. I'm going to withdraw when I should open up. I'm broken in ways I don't even fully understand yet. I'm not afraid of broken things, Josephine whispered. And I'm not asking for perfection. I'm just asking for a chance. He leaned in then, slowly enough that she could have pulled away and kissed her. It was soft and tentative, a question more than a demand. Josephine answered by kissing him back, her free hand coming up to rest on his chest, feeling his heart pound beneath her palm. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against hers. Stay, he whispered. Please stay, not as a housekeeper, as my wife if you'll have me. I know it's fast and I know I'm asking a lot, but I can't bear the thought of you leaving. Yes, Josephine said without hesitation. Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll marry you. They sat on the floor of his mother's room, holding each other while the storm raged outside, and for the first time in months, Yates felt something other than grief. He felt hope. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. Yates and Josephine told Pete and Cisco at breakfast, and both men were genuinely delighted. Pete insisted on riding into Deer Lodge immediately to tell Martha Thompson, who would spread the news to the whole town faster than any newspaper. "We should do this properly," Yates said when they were alone. "Court, I mean. Even though we've already agreed to marry, you deserve to be courted." "We're living on the same ranch," Josephine pointed out, amused. "How exactly do you plan to court me? You'll see." And he did. Despite the demands of ranch work, despite his natural reticence, Yates set about courting Josephine with a determination that was both endearing and surprising. He picked wildflowers and left them on the kitchen table. He took her riding in the evenings to show her the prettiest parts of the ranch. He talked to her, really talked, sharing stories about his childhood, his parents, his dreams for the ranch. He was awkward about it, often stumbling over his words, but his sincerity shone through. Josephine fell more in love with him each day. She loved how gently he handled the horses, how he was fair but firm with Pete and Cisco, how he'd sometimes catch her eye across the room and smile like they shared a wonderful secret. She loved how he was trying so hard to be open with her, even when it clearly made him uncomfortable. 2 weeks after the storm, they rode into Deer Lodge to make arrangements with the local pastor. The town had heard about their engagement, thanks to Martha Thompson's efficient gossip network, and most people seemed genuinely pleased. There were a few raised eyebrows at the speed of their courtship, but this was Montana territory in 1884, and pragmatic marriages were common enough not to cause scandal. The wedding was set for a Saturday in late October. Josephine had worried about having nothing appropriate to wear, but Martha Thompson rallied the women of Deer Lodge, and together they altered a beautiful dress that had belonged to Martha's daughter. It was cream-colored with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, simpler than the elaborate gowns worn back east but perfect for a ranch wedding. The night before the wedding, Josephine sat in her cabin for the last time, reflecting on how much her life had changed in just 2 months. She'd arrived in Deer Lodge thinking she was unwanted, a burden, someone the world had no place for. Now she was marrying a good man who looked at her like she was precious, who'd given her a home and a purpose. There was a knock on her cabin door. When she opened it, Yates stood there looking uncertain. "I know it's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding," he said, "but I wanted to give you something." He held out a small box. Inside was a ring, simple gold with a small sapphire. "It was my mother's," Yates said quietly. "My father gave it to her when they married. She wanted me to give it to my wife someday. I know you never met her, but I think she would have liked you. You're strong like she was, kind like she was." Josephine's eyes filled with tears. "I wish I could have known her." "Me too." He gently took the ring and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "There, now it's official, even before tomorrow." "Yates," she said softly, "thank you for taking a chance on me, for seeing me when I felt invisible." "Josephine, you were never invisible. From the moment you stood in that wagon, chin up, refusing to accept no for an answer, I saw you. That's why I was scared. Because I saw you, really saw you, and I knew you could break my heart." "I won't," she promised. "I'll spend every day proving that you didn't make a mistake taking me in." He cupped her face in his hands, this gesture that had become familiar between them. "You already have. Every single day, you've proven that you're exactly where you're supposed to be." They married the next day in the small church in Deer Lodge. Josephine wore the cream-colored dress and carried wildflowers that Yates had picked that morning. Pete and Cisco served as witnesses, both men suspiciously emotional throughout the ceremony. Martha Thompson cried openly. Half the town turned out, curious about the mail-order bride who'd ended up marrying a different rancher than intended. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Yates kissed Josephine with a tenderness that made her heart soar. This was real. This was happening. She was wanted. She was loved. She was home. The wedding celebration was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food prepared by half the women in town. There was music from a fiddler, dancing, laughter. Josephine found herself pulled into conversations with ranchers' wives who welcomed her into their community. She wasn't an outsider anymore. She belonged. As the sun set and the celebration continued, Yates pulled her aside, away from the crowd, to the porch of the main house where they could watch the mountains turn purple in the fading light. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Happier than I ever imagined being," she said honestly. "You've given me so much, Yates. A home, a purpose, a family. You've made me feel wanted every single day." "You are wanted," he said fiercely. "Every single day for the rest of our lives. I'm going to make sure you know that." Their wedding night was spent in the main house, in the master bedroom that Yates had cleaned and prepared. He was gentle and patient, and when they finally lay tangled together in the darkness, Josephine felt complete in a way she never had before. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," she whispered. Yates was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. "When my mother was dying, she made me promise I'd find someone to share my life with. Said she couldn't bear the thought of me being alone. I told her I would, but I didn't mean it. I thought I'd just throw myself into work and eventually I'd be too old for it to matter. Then you showed up, stubborn and determined, and I couldn't help myself. I think my mother would say she planned it somehow." Josephine smiled in the darkness. "Maybe she did. I'd like to think so. What about you? Tell me something I don't know." "I used to dream about being a teacher," Josephine admitted. "Before my parents died, I loved learning. I thought maybe I'd teach in a small school somewhere. But after they died, there was no money for more education and the dream seemed foolish." "It's not foolish," Yates said firmly. "Deer Lodge has a school, but I hear they're always looking for help. If you wanted to teach, even just part-time, I'd support that." "Really?" She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Really? I married you because I love you, Josephine, not because I need a housekeeper. If teaching would make you happy, then we'll figure it out." She kissed him, pouring all her gratitude and love into it. "How did I get so lucky?" I ask myself the same question every day. The months that followed were an adjustment as they learned to live together as husband and wife. Yates was true to his word about his tendency to withdraw when upset, and there were moments when Josephine had to push past his walls. But each time, he let her in a little more easily. He talked about his parents, about his fears for the ranch, about the loneliness that had consumed him after his mother's death. Josephine shared her own fears, her lingering insecurity that she was somehow inadequate. Yates countered each doubt with steady reassurance, showing her through actions and words that she was valued. When she mentioned teaching again, he rode into town and spoke with the schoolmaster himself. Within a month, Josephine was helping with reading lessons twice a week, and the joy it brought her was evident to everyone. Winter came to Montana territory with a vengeance. The first snow fell in November, and by December, the ranch was blanketed in white. Josephine had never experienced a winter so harsh, but Yates made sure she was prepared, teaching her about layering clothes and recognizing signs of frostbite. The cattle had to be moved to lower pastures, and there were days when Yates worked in dangerous conditions to keep the herd safe. One particularly bad storm in January kept Yates out all night with Pete and Cisco, searching for cattle that had wandered. Josephine stayed up, pacing the kitchen, jumping at every sound. When they finally returned at dawn, all three men were half frozen and exhausted. Josephine had hot coffee and food ready, and she helped Yates out of his frozen outer layers, her hands shaking with relief. "I was so worried," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry." He pulled her close despite his cold clothes. "Had to make sure we didn't lose any cattle. Winter's hard enough without losing stock." "I don't care about the cattle," she said fiercely. "I care about you. Promise me you'll be more careful." "I promise," he said, and she could hear in his voice that he meant it. "I've got something to come home to now. I won't take unnecessary risks." As winter slowly gave way to spring, the ranch came alive again. Calves were born, requiring round-the-clock attention during the birthing season. Josephine helped where she could, learning about ranching despite having no previous experience. She was there when Yates delivered a breech calf, her presence steadying him through the difficult birth. When the calf finally stood on wobbly legs, Yates looked at her with such pride and love that she felt her heart might burst. "You're a natural," he said, grinning. "Hardly. I was terrified the whole time. You didn't show it. You were calm and helpful. That's what matters." In April, Josephine realized her monthly courses were late. She waited another week, not wanting to say anything until she was sure. But when a second week passed, she could no longer deny the possibility. She was pregnant. She told Yates that evening after dinner, nervous despite knowing he'd be happy. They'd talked about children, about wanting a family, but talking and reality were different things. "Yates," she said, her hands twisting in her apron, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the ranch accounts he was reviewing, immediately attentive. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." "At least I don't think so. I hope not." She took a breath. "I'm pregnant." The accounts book fell from his hands. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, and for a horrible moment Josephine thought she'd miscalculated his reaction. Then he was across the room, lifting her into his arms, spinning her carefully. "Really? You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor. I'm 6 weeks late." He set her down gently, his hands framing her face, and she saw tears in his eyes. "A baby. We're having a baby." "You're happy." "Happy, Josephine, I'm beyond happy. I'm terrified and thrilled and grateful." He kissed her softly. "Thank you. Thank you for giving me this, for giving me a family again." "We're doing this together," she reminded him. "Together," he agreed. The pregnancy was confirmed by the doctor in Deer Lodge a week later. Josephine was healthy, and the baby was due in early November. Yates immediately became protective to the point of being overprotective, insisting she rest more, not lift anything heavy, not work too hard. Josephine found it endearing and exasperating in equal measure. "I'm pregnant, not an invalid," she told him when he tried to stop her from carrying a basket of laundry. "I know, but I want to make sure you and the baby are safe." "We will be, but I also need to keep living my life." Women have been having babies and running households for thousands of years. He relented, but she'd often catch him watching her with a mixture of awe and worry. She supposed she understood. He'd lost his parents, had been alone for so long. This baby represented hope, a future, continuation of his family line. As summer progressed, Josephine's belly grew, and with it came the reality of impending parenthood. They spent evenings discussing names, debating whether to convert the spare bedroom upstairs into a nursery or keep the baby in their room initially. Yates built a cradle with his own hands, working on it in the evenings, each piece carefully sanded and fitted. One evening in late August, Josephine found him in the barn, sitting beside the finished cradle, tears streaming down his face. "Yates!" She lowered herself carefully onto the bench beside him, her bulk making her movements slower. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right, and that's what's overwhelming." He wiped at his face. "A year ago I was alone. I'd convinced myself I'd always be alone. Now I have you, and soon we'll have a baby, and I'm sitting here finishing this cradle, and it hit me how much my life has changed." "How much you've changed it." Josephine took his hand. "My life has changed just as much. I thought I was unwanted, remember? I thought I'd spend my whole life feeling like I was taking up space in a world that had no room for me. Then you gave me a home, a purpose, love. You've spent every single day since we met proving I was wrong about being unwanted." "You were never unwanted," Yates said fiercely. "Even before I was willing to admit I was falling for you, even when I was keeping you at a distance. I wanted you here. I was just too scared to acknowledge it." "Well, you don't have to be scared anymore. I'm not going anywhere." He kissed her then, tender and sweet, one hand resting on her rounded belly. The baby kicked, as if joining the conversation, and they both laughed. September and October passed in a blur of final preparations. The nursery was ready, painted a soft yellow that caught the morning light. Josephine had sewn tiny clothes, her seamstress skills put to use creating gowns and blankets. Martha Thompson and other women from town had thrown a gathering where they'd brought gifts. More clothes, blankets, advice both helpful and overwhelming. On a cold November morning, 2 weeks before the expected due date, Josephine woke to cramping pains. She lay still for a moment, timing them before shaking Yates awake. "It's time," she said simply. To his credit, Yates didn't panic. He helped her dress, sent Pete racing into town for the doctor and Martha Thompson, and stayed with Josephine, holding her hand through the contractions. When Martha arrived, she shooed Yates out of the room despite his protests. "This is women's work," she said firmly. "You go pace somewhere else." Labor was long and difficult. Josephine had heard stories from other women, but the reality was more intense than she'd imagined. Martha and the doctor coached her through it, and somewhere in the haze of pain and exhaustion, she heard the clock strike midnight. November 2nd had become November 3rd. Finally, as dawn was breaking, the baby came. A boy, red-faced and howling, perfect in every way. "He's healthy," the doctor pronounced, cleaning the infant. "Strong lungs, good color. Congratulations, Mrs. Xerxes." Martha called for Yates, who burst into the room looking haggard. When he saw Josephine holding their son, his face transformed. He approached slowly, reverently, as if afraid he might break the spell. "A son," Josephine said, her voice hoarse from effort. "We have a son." Yates sat carefully on the edge of the bed, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny fist. The infant grasped his finger, and Yates made a choked sound. "He's perfect. You're perfect. I don't have words for this." "You don't need words," Josephine said softly. "Just be here with us." They named him Wyatt Thomas Xerxes, the first name meaning brave in battle, the middle name after Yates' father. As Josephine recovered from the birth, she watched Yates with their son and fell in love with him all over again. He was so gentle, so careful, talking to Wyatt in a low voice as he changed diapers or walked the floor during nighttime crying sessions. "I didn't know you could be this tender," she told him one night, watching him rock Wyatt back to sleep. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But he's so small, so dependent. I want him to always know he's loved, that he's wanted. Like you want me to know I'm wanted." "Exactly like that." The first winter with a newborn was exhausting but joyful. Wyatt was a good baby, healthy and growing fast. Josephine's teaching had to be put on hold temporarily, but she didn't mind. These early months with her son were precious, and she knew she'd never get them back. As spring returned again, they fell into a new rhythm. Josephine gradually resumed teaching part-time, bringing Wyatt with her when she did. The schoolchildren were delighted to have a baby in the classroom, and Wyatt seemed to enjoy the attention. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching Wyatt crawl around on a blanket, Yates said, "I want to tell you something." Josephine looked at him, curious about his serious tone. "When my mother died, I thought my life was essentially over. Not that I wanted to die, but I couldn't imagine feeling joy again. I was just existing, going through the motions. Then you came, and slowly, day by day, you brought me back to life. You made the house a home again. You taught me it was okay to grieve, but also okay to live. And now we have Wyatt, and every day is better than the last. I need you to know that. I need you to know that you saved me." Josephine's eyes filled with tears. "You saved me too. I was so lost, Yates, so convinced that I didn't matter to anyone. You showed me I was wrong. You've proven it every single day." "I'll keep proving it," he promised. "Every single day for the rest of our lives." And he did. Over the years that followed, Yates showed Josephine in countless small ways that she was cherished. He supported her teaching, which expanded from part-time to nearly full-time as Wyatt grew older. He helped with housework without being asked, understanding that they were partners in all things. He told her he loved her every morning and every night and often in between. 2 years after Wyatt was born, Josephine gave birth to a daughter they named Julia Rose. She had Josephine's blonde hair and Yates' blue eyes, and she wrapped her father around her tiny finger from day one. Wyatt was initially uncertain about sharing his parents' attention, but he quickly became a devoted big brother. The ranch prospered under Yates' management. With Josephine's support and partnership, he was able to expand gradually, hiring more hands, increasing the herd. They never became wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. When Wyatt was 5 and Julia 3, Josephine found herself pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to twin boys they named Lucas and Logan. The house became joyfully chaotic with 4 children under 6. There were moments of exhaustion and frustration, but there was also so much love and laughter that the walls seemed to ring with it. Pete and Cisco remained with the ranch, becoming honorary uncles to the children. Martha Thompson was a frequent visitor, always ready with advice or an extra pair of hands. The community of Deer Lodge had fully embraced Josephine as one of their own. One day, when Josephine was 30 and Wyatt was 8, he asked her, "Mama, how did you and Papa meet?" They were in the kitchen making bread, and Josephine paused in her kneading. "That's a long story." "I want to hear it," Wyatt insisted. Julia, who was playing nearby, chimed in with agreement. So Josephine told them in age-appropriate terms about coming to Deer Lodge to marry a man she'd never met, only to find he'd died. About meeting their father and being hired as a housekeeper. About falling in love despite both of them being afraid. "Were you scared?" Julia asked. "Very scared," Josephine admitted. "I thought nobody wanted me." "But Papa wanted you," Wyatt said confidently. "He did, and he spent every day since proving it to me." "What's all this?" Yates asked, coming into the kitchen with Lucas and Logan toddling behind him, both covered in dirt from helping in the barn. "Mama's telling us how you fell in love," Julia informed him. Yates met Josephine's eyes across the kitchen, and the look they shared was full of warmth and understanding and deep, abiding love. "Is that so? And what did she tell you?" "That you wanted her even when she thought nobody did," Wyatt said. "That's true," Yates said, moving to stand beside Josephine, his arm automatically going around her waist. "Your mama is the most wanted person in this whole territory. By me, by you children, by half of Deer Lodge." "You're exaggerating," Josephine said, but she was smiling. "I'm not," he insisted. He looked at their children, all watching them with interest. "You kids need to understand something. The day your mama arrived in Deer Lodge was the luckiest day of my life. She was brave and strong and kind, and she still is. And if there's one thing I want you to remember, it's that people are valuable not because of what they do or how useful they are, but because of who they are. Your mama taught me that. Later that night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Yates and Josephine sat on the porch as they so often did, watching the sun set over the mountains. You ever think about how different things could have been? Josephine asked. If Chester Hendricks hadn't died, if I'd married him instead, I try not to, Yates admitted. It's too painful to imagine you with someone else. I don't think I would have been happy, Josephine said thoughtfully. Not like I am with you. With Chester, it would have been practical, a business arrangement. With you, it's love. It is love, Yates agreed. The deepest kind. He paused, then added, You know what I think about sometimes? That day you brought me lunch in the barn when you compared me to a horse. I almost smiled then, and it surprised me. I hadn't wanted to smile in months. That was when I knew you were dangerous. Dangerous, Josephine laughed, to my carefully constructed walls. You were slipping past them, making me feel things I decided I was done feeling. It terrified me. And now I'm grateful for it, for you, for this life we've built. He took her hand, rubbing his thumb across the sapphire ring she still wore. I meant what I told the children today. You're the most wanted person in my world. Every single day, Josephine. Every single day I want you more than the day before. Tears slipped down Josephine's cheeks. Even after years of marriage, Yates still had the power to move her with his words. I love you so much. I love you too, always. As the years continued to pass, the Xerxes family became a fixture in Deer Lodge. Wyatt grew into a young man who shared his father's love of ranching, but also his mother's love of learning. Julia proved to be gifted with horses, training them with patience and skill. Lucas and Logan were inseparable, always getting into mischief together but fiercely loyal to their family. When Josephine was 35, she and Yates were surprised by one more pregnancy. Margaret Ann, their youngest, was born in the spring when the wildflowers were blooming. She was a peaceful baby, seeming content to watch the world with wise eyes. 5 children, Yates said one night, holding Margaret while Josephine rested. We certainly have a full house. Too full, Josephine teased. Never, though I think we might be done now. You've given me more than I ever dreamed of. The children grew, and with them, the ranch. Wyatt began taking on more responsibilities, learning the business of ranching from his father. Julia started a small horse training business, her reputation for skill spreading beyond Deer Lodge. Lucas and Logan talked about starting their own ranch someday. But for now, they were content to learn from their father. Montana Territory became the state of Montana in 1889, a momentous occasion that the whole town celebrated. By then, Josephine and Yates had been married for 5 years, and their love had only deepened. They'd weathered hard winters, difficult calving seasons, the everyday struggles of ranch life and raising children. Through it all, they'd remained partners, supporting each other, loving each other. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised Josephine with a trip to Helena, the state capital. They left the children with Martha Thompson and spent 3 days exploring the city, staying in a hotel, eating in restaurants, being a couple without the constant demands of ranch life. This is wonderful, Josephine said as they walked through the city streets. But I miss the children already. So do I, Yates admitted. But it's good for us to have time together, just the two of us, to remember who we are beyond being parents. That night in their hotel room, they talked for hours about their life together, about the early days when they were both so uncertain, about how far they'd come, about their hopes and dreams for the future. You have any regrets? Yates asked. None, Josephine said without hesitation. Everything I've done, every choice I've made has led me here. To you, to our family, how could I regret any of that? I regret keeping you at a distance at first, All that time I wasted being afraid. You weren't ready then. And besides, it makes what we have now even more precious. We both know what it's like to be lonely, to feel unwanted, so we never take each other for granted." "No," Yates agreed. "We never do." As the 1890s progressed, the West continued to change. The frontier was closing, civilization spreading. Deer Lodge grew, adding more businesses, more people. The old wild days were fading into memory and legend, but the Xerxes Ranch remained, a constant in a changing world. Josephine continued teaching, watching generations of children learn their letters. Yates remained a respected member of the ranching community, known for his fair dealing and hard work. Their children grew into young adults, each finding their own path while remaining tied to the family and the land. Wyatt married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, and they built a house on the western edge of the Xerxes land. Julia surprised everyone by falling in love with a traveling veterinarian who settled in Deer Lodge to be near her. Lucas and Logan did eventually start their own ranch, though they remained close to their parents. Margaret, the youngest, showed signs of following her mother into teaching. Josephine and Yates became grandparents, watching their children navigate parenthood with the same mixture of joy and exhaustion they remembered. They offered advice when asked, babysat frequently, and marveled at how quickly time passed. One evening, when Josephine was 45 and Yates 50, they sat on their porch as they had countless times before. The house was quiet, all the children grown and living their own lives. It was just the two of them again, in many ways back where they'd started. "You miss it?" Yates asked. "When the house was full of noise and chaos, sometimes," Josephine admitted, "but I also appreciate this. Time with you without distractions. We're so busy when the grandchildren are here." "We are," he agreed, "and I love that, but I love this too. Just sitting here with you, watching the sunset." He reached for her hand, as he'd done thousands of times over the years. "You know what I was thinking about today?" "What?" "That first month you were here. How I fought against what I was feeling. How scared I was to let you in. And how you just kept being yourself, kind and determined and steady. You didn't let my walls stop you." "I was terrified you'd send me away," Josephine confessed. "That month felt like it lasted forever and no time at all. Every day I was trying to prove I deserved to stay." "You never had to prove anything," Yates said. "You were always enough, Josephine, always." "Took me a while to believe that," she said. "But you showed me every single day. You made me feel wanted when I'd given up on feeling that way. You made me want to live again when I'd resigned myself to just existing. We saved each other." They sat in comfortable silence, hands joined, watching the light fade over the mountains. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The air smelled of approaching autumn, that particular sharpness that meant summer was ending. "I want you to know something," Yates said eventually. "If I had my life to live over, if I could change anything, I wouldn't, not a single thing, because it all led to this, to you, to our family, to this life we've built together." "I feel the same way," Josephine said. "Every hardship, every moment of doubt, every struggle was worth it to end up here with you." "Forever," Yates said. "That's what I want, forever with you." "You have it," Josephine promised. "Forever." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they remained on the porch, two people who'd found each other when they both most needed finding. The lonely cowboy and the mail-order bride who thought she was unwanted had proven that love, real love, wasn't about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It was about choosing each other, every single day, through all the ordinary moments and extraordinary challenges that made up a life. Years continued to pass, marked by seasons and celebrations, by births and eventually deaths. Pete passed peacefully in his sleep at 70, and Cisco followed 2 years later. The Xerxes family mourned them as the beloved members of the family they'd become. Josephine and Yates grew old together, their hair turning gray, their steps slower, but their love undiminished. They spent their later years surrounded by children, grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. The ranch remained in the family, passed down to Wyatt but worked by all the siblings in partnership. On a warm June evening, when Josephine was 68 and Yates 73, they sat together on their porch one last time. Yates had been ill for several months, his heart weakening, and they both knew his time was short. But he'd insisted on coming outside to watch one more sunset with his wife. "You remember," he said, his voice thin but steady, "that night during the storm. When you found me crying in my mother's room." "I remember," Josephine said, holding his hand carefully. "That was the night everything changed. You told me that grief doesn't make you weak, that it makes you human. You were right about that. You were right about so many things." He paused to catch his breath. "I want to thank you, Josephine, for 50 years of love, for giving me a reason to live when I'd lost all my reasons, for being my partner in everything." "You don't need to thank me," Josephine said through her tears. "Loving you has been the greatest joy of my life." "Mine too," Yates said. He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "Every single day you were the best part of my day. Every single day I was grateful you chose me." "I'd choose you again," Josephine said fiercely. "1,000 times I'd choose you." "I know," he said, smiling. "That's why I'm not afraid, because I know what we have doesn't end. Love like ours, it goes on." Yates passed peacefully 3 days later, surrounded by his family. Josephine held his hand as he took his last breath, and though her heart broke, she also felt gratitude for the life they'd shared. He'd given her 50 years of love, of feeling wanted and valued. He'd proven every single day that she mattered. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Montana. Yates had been respected and liked, and the outpouring of support for the family was tremendous. Josephine bore it with grace, comforted by her children and grandchildren. In the months that followed, Josephine struggled with Yates' absence. The house felt empty without him, even when it was full of family. But she'd learned from him about surviving grief, about letting yourself feel it while still choosing to live. She continued teaching for another 2 years, finally retiring at 70. She spent her time with family, reading, working in her garden, and most evenings, sitting on the porch watching the sunset, feeling Yates' presence in the mountain wind. One evening, sitting there with a quilt around her shoulders, Wyatt joined her. He was 50 now, with gray threading his dark hair, but to Josephine he'd always be her little boy. "Tell me again how you met Papa," he said, sitting in the chair that had been his father's. Josephine smiled. "You've heard that story 100 times. I want to hear it again. I want to remember." So Josephine told him, as she had many times over the years, about arriving in Deer Lodge lost and alone, about meeting Yates prickly and grieving, about slowly, tentatively falling in love, about building a life together day by day, choice by choice. "He used to say you saved him," Wyatt said when she finished. "We saved each other," Josephine corrected. "That's what love does. It saves us from loneliness, from despair, from giving up. Your father taught me that I was wanted when I didn't believe it was possible. And every single day after that he proved it. That was his gift to me." "What was your gift to him?" Josephine thought about it. "Hope, I suppose. Hope that life could be good again, that joy was possible even after loss, that it was worth opening his heart despite the risk of being hurt." "That's a good gift," Wyatt said. "It was what we both needed," Josephine said. "Timing matters in love. We found each other at exactly the right moment, when we were both ready to take a chance on something new." Josephine lived to be 76, dying peacefully in her sleep on a cold January night. Her children found her in the morning, a slight smile on her face, clutching one of Yates' old shirts to her chest. They buried her beside him on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a headstone that read, Josephine Vaughn Xerxes, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and teacher. She was wanted. The Xerxes ranch continued through the generations, each one adding their own chapter to the family story. But the story that was told most often, especially on quiet evenings when the family gathered, was about the mail-order bride and the lonely cowboy. About how they'd both thought they were unwanted, and how they'd proven each other wrong every single day. It became a family legend, this love story. A reminder that love isn't always immediate or easy. Sometimes it grows slowly, carefully, built on daily choices and small kindnesses. Sometimes it comes when you least expect it, to people who have given up hope. But when it comes, when you're brave enough to reach for it, it can transform everything. In Deer Lodge, there's still a ranch on the outskirts of town. The original house still stands, weathered by over a century of Montana weather. The barn where Yates once worked still houses horses. The hill where Josephine and Yates are buried offers the same view of the mountains they watched together for 50 years. And sometimes, locals say, if you're there at sunset, you can feel something in the air. A sense of peace, of love that lasted beyond death, of two souls who found each other when they both needed finding. The mail-order bride who thought she was unwanted. The lonely cowboy who proved her wrong. Every single day. Forever.